practice that I do in the class, but before we get into that, I'm going to pass around copies of an article from the current issue of Foreign Affairs entitled "How to Solve the Food Crisis." It's written by a man named Paul Collins, who is a professor in the UK. His approach is a little more prescriptive and maybe a little less comprehensive than what I'm going to try to do, but it reminds us that food prices and food availability are important issues if you look globally. That same issue of Foreign Affairs, incidentally, has an article co-authored by Dean Atwood on Can Washington Get Development Right? So it might be worth, I should have brought copies of that too, but it's worth looking at.
And I think also this particular issue of Foreign Affairs has a very favorable review of Michael Barnett's new book too, so this is a very valuable issue.
The second thing I'm going to pass around is an outline of what I'm going to talk about. This is practice that I've used in my class, and I think it works well because people aren't worried about taking notes. They can worry about asking questions, and specifically to Bob's question to me, please do interrupt me. Don't make me talk for the full hour and 5 minutes that we have here. What I'd like to do is start off by talking about food security in 6 different facets, because it is a much more complicated issue than many of us sometimes think. The first and the most basic of those attributes is what's called adequate access, meeting the basic caloric needs for a full, healthy, active life. Interestingly, it's not a problem of supply. The global gap between food production and food needs in order to give everybody in the world an adequate diet is only about 40 million metric tons, which sounds like a lot, but that's less than 2% of global food production. The problem is poverty, that there are a lot of people in the world who simply cannot afford to express their need for calories actively in the market through economic demand. The absolute poor are chronically hungry. There are about 800 to 900 million people in the world today who are chronically hungry, whose caloric needs are simply not met. The marginally poor are intermittently suffering from chronic hunger. There's a geographic profile to this dimension of food security. The largest number of food insecure people in the world is in South Asia. The highest percentage of the population that is food insecure is in Africa. It's probably for that reason that we hear more about African food security issues than South Asian, but in fact there are more hungry people in South Asia. There's also a human profile to food insecurity. Hunger tends to concentrate among women and children, partly because of the dynamics of the family, and partly because there are times when they have higher needs that go unmet. Solutions, and we in my class we do talk about these in a lot more detail, but so I'm just going to skim over some of these ideas today. There are really, I think, 3 solutions to the chronic hunger problem. The first is targeted assistance. By that I mean that developing countries need to avoid the temptation to keep food prices low as an attempt to address hunger, because that discourages local output, but rather to target feeding programs on those vulnerable populations that exist within those countries. And the international community has a role to play there. Second, infrastructure to deliver both trade and aid. Many of the chronically hungry live in areas, regions that are difficult to access, are poorly served by transportation infrastructure, and some of that chronic hunger is related to that problem. But the ultimate solution is economic growth. lifting people out of the poverty that causes them to be food insecure. The second dimension of food security is what I call reliable access. And this means not only having access to adequate calories, but having that access all the time. It's manifested most typically in periodic shortages or in price shocks. This is probably the face of hunger that most of us see, because this is the image that you oftentimes see on television when there is a food crisis. That's usually caused by a combination of a crop failure problem locally and breakdown in governance, in civil order, so that the normal commercial channels don't work, and oftentimes the international aid channels don't work or work very poorly. Just as an example of the problem here, food production can fluctuate as much as 25% from one year to the next in localized regions. Because poor crops somewhere are offset by good crops elsewhere, globally, we've not experienced in the last 100 years a fluctuation of more than 3% above or below trend. So there's enormous capacity in the system to stabilize these shocks if the system is able to work globally. Contributing causes to this kind of crisis hunger, again, inadequate infrastructure, the inability to bring in food supplies to a locally impacted region. Generalized trade barriers. In other words, excuse me, if countries have not been trading with each other, and one of those countries or regions suffers a crop shortfall, the neighbors, who are oftentimes best positioned to provide additional supplies to tide them over, are unable to access that market because the normal pattern has been highly protected tariff walls, quotas, or other limits. And so you don't have a commercial response that can be triggered quickly, sort of in the neighborhood. Also, what I call emergency barriers are a significant problem, and the article that I circulated talks a fair amount about this. Countries, when they experience either rising prices or a crop shortage, are oftentimes brought to intervene either by controlling prices or limiting exports. And what this does is shift the problem onto the shoulders of others, and in the process magnify the problem for others. And this, in fact, was probably the major factor once food prices started rising, commodity prices started rising the beginning of this year. It was this emergency barrier response that added the last $2 and $3 and $4 a bushel onto prices. It's important to recognize that price shocks hurt the poor disproportionately for several reasons. First place, the high share of their income goes to food, typically 50% or more. So they're not in a position to absorb a price shock. Second, their diets are typically fairly simple and therefore linked more directly to commodity prices than diets here. And third, their food prices are not cushioned or moderated by food processing costs. One of my pet peeves is that farmers in this country, when prices are low, commodity prices are low, complain that they get such a small share of the price that consumers pay for a box of cornflakes. But when prices are high, they turn that argument on its head and say, you can't blame us for high prices because the price of cornflakes goes up so little compared to the price of corn. Well, both are misleading because they're shifting attention from the people who are really suffering from this price volatility, and that's the poor. Oftentimes people want to build up commodity reserves in order to deal with this reliability problem. In my view, that's a very expensive solution. It costs 20 to 25% of a commodity's value to store it for 1 year, even disregarding deterioration in quality and losses. Forward positioned reserves, which you sometimes hear advocated, are even more costly because you build in the transportation cost to forward position those reserves in countries that are vulnerable. And they're less flexible. If you miscalculate as to where the next problem comes, they're very poorly positioned to go to where the problem is. Again, solutions that we talk about a lot in the class, how to use more open trading regimes to deal with this problem. On average, and averages of course can be misleading, but on average 85% of the food that is consumed locally is produced locally. But that traded margin, that 10 to 15%, is very important for pricing the whole commodity sector and for developing the infrastructure that you need when periodic shortages or price shocks occur. Clearly the problem is not going to be solved until we get better governance. And there's no obvious easy answer to that problem. There is an answer, however, to this emergency controls problem. There ought to be ways for countries to negotiate some kind of arrangement that makes export controls in particular a policy tool that we all take off the table because it's a very vicious and expensive way of dealing with the problem. Finally, we need to talk a lot more about financial reserves. Poor suffer food crises both when there is a supply shock to the system, but also when there's a general shock to their economy. So import bills can mount either because prices go up or because as a share of their foreign exchange reserves they become more important. And financial reserves would help keep these countries in the market either when their own forex reserves constrain their buying or when they have a price shock. The third face of food security is food safety. Actually, this is one that has probably been in the press a fair amount in the last few months. Basically, it means, by this I mean, that the food supply doesn't become a vehicle for foodborne illnesses, whether they're bacteria, kinds of illnesses, or whether they're more exotic things like mad cow disease or avian influenza. It requires proper storage, handling, and preparation in order to manage this issue. Typically, the conditions that you find in many poor countries of poor sanitation, haphazard waste disposal, and contaminated water supplies greatly aggravate the problem. The longer supply chains that we see developing around the world today have increased both the real risks of foodborne illnesses and the concerns that consumers have about them. The solutions, better use than we have been making of science-based safety standards. There are institutions like the Codex Alimentarius where science-based food safety practices are outlined. Again, more normal commerce, which would help countries raise their own internal food standards. If you want to export to the United States, you either need to adopt U.S. food safety standards or, hopefully, we can get around to this, persuade the United States to recognize the standards that you have in your country as providing a similar degree of safety. China is going through that experience right now, and it's interesting that the pressure that is coming from foreign markets that they want to serve is forcing them to change not only their export regimes, but also their whole domestic food handling regime, and we need more of that. Also, technology transfers. modern cold chains, modern packaging. There are a lot of fairly easily transferred technologies that can greatly reduce the risks here. The fourth phase of food security, in my definition, is what I call nutritional adequacy. It's having a balanced nutritional makeup to your diet, particularly having the essential micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals that you need for a healthy life. There are high-risk groups, particularly pregnant women and young children, because of, in the case of the pregnant women, their need to nourish the baby. In the case of the babies and infants and toddlers, they're going through rapid development, particularly of the brain, and if they don't get adequate nutrition, the stunting that occurs in those first years sticks with them for life. This is an area where the solutions are relatively easy and low cost. Food fortification can be done at very low cost. Deworming and diarrhea, in other words, helping consumers use efficiently the nutrients that are delivered to them, is also a very low-cost strategy. There's been a lot of discussion and maybe not as much progress on the third one that I list there, biotech, using biotechnology to improve the nutritional profile of staple foods. But I think longer term, that's a very promising solution as well. The fifth phase of food security is sustainability, in the sense that we don't meet our generation's food needs at the expense of our ability to meet future generations' food needs. Unfortunately, land degradation is worst in the poorest regions of the world. And oftentimes, not just poor regions, but regions that are have large populations and rapidly growing populations, so that the demographic factors that are already stressing those resources are getting worse rather than better. Africa, 2/3 of Africa's lands are degraded, some of them very seriously. Latin America, half of the agricultural land is degraded. In Asia, less, it's only 40%. But in Asia, there are serious water stress problems.
Can you say around how bad things have to be before you characterize them as degraded?
Well, it is probably a moving definition, but this data comes from National Standards Organization that looks at measures it by the productivity of the soil. In cases in Africa, there are, because they've had a practice of slash and burn in agriculture, they will mine all of the nutrients out of the soil and move on. That soil is degraded not simply because of erosion problems, but because the nutrient base is gone, and it may take, I was talking to someone who had a project in Kenya where they were trying to bring in modern seed and seed technologies to raise corn yields, and they said some of the soils there would take as much as 5 years to bring back to a level where they could be financially rewarding to use the new technology. But it's not a what do I want to say? It's not a light switch. It's a rheostat, and you can keep sliding well past simple degradation. This is where actually one of the more sensitive parts of the food security debate occurs, because there is this tension between extensification, dealing with the problem of degraded lands by moving on and bringing new land into production, versus intensification, which is taking the existing land base and applying additional resources to it in order to increase its productivity and its yields. The environmental community, I think, is increasingly coming around to the view that intensification of agriculture is a better strategy for the environment, for sustainability, than extensification, for a variety of reasons. One of which is clearly extensification, converting new lands to agricultural uses, destroys habitat, undermines biodiversity, but more recently the science has shown that most of the carbon that is released by agriculture is released from the soil rather than from above ground. And when you convert virgin lands to agricultural uses, you release an enormous amount of carbon. So that has become a much larger concern. At the other extreme, the technologies around intensification have improved in significant ways with respect to the environmental agenda. No-till agriculture, for example, leaving residues on the soil, has reduced water runoff and improves soil tilth and the like. Precision farming, which is combining computers and GPS technology to vary seeding rates and nutrient application rates per square foot, is maybe overstating it, but per square yard or per square meter, has allowed farmers to reduce the amount of runoff, the amount of nutrients that are lost to the plants and run off into the water. So we are both becoming increasingly concerned about the consequences of bringing new land into agriculture and at the same time improving the technologies with respect to intensification as against the goals of sustainability.
Well, does intensification require more?
I'm sorry?
More application of chemicals?
More application of different kinds of chemicals in some cases. For example, well, it depends on, if you're going to no-till agriculture, for example, one of the things you are doing is substituting contact pesticides, post-emergent pesticides, for chemicals that previously you might have been plowing into the ground when you ran over the field. So you've got less, in many cases you have less active ingredients, you have better active ingredients, but the main thing is that you have active ingredients that have less penetration into the soils of the environment. And in fact, I was just at a meeting with Syngenta 2 weeks ago, who makes atrazine, and popular target of environmentalists, and properly so. They say that they now apply only 30% of the atrazine that they used to, because they found a mix of chemicals that requires them to use, that reduces the requirement for the atrazine and allows them to use a mix that is less toxic and less risky for the groundwater supplies over time. Good. Keep asking questions. As you've gathered by now, I'm a big fan of using trade tools as addressing food security issues. And I think there's an interesting case to be made around sustainability, that in fact expanding trade of land-intensive crops that are grown in countries with a minimal amount of degraded land, with stable populations, in other words, their demand's not going up, shipping those to countries that have rapidly growing populations, resource stress, and a high percentage of their agricultural resources already degraded, is very compelling. And the economics also work. What that tends to mean is that you're going to see increasing flows of grains and oilseeds from OECD countries, where population growth rates are not very high, to poor developing countries where they are very high and where the stress on the environment is very substantial. Hopefully, that'll be matched by flow backwards of labor-intensive agricultural products from poor countries to the wealthy, land-rich, resource-rich countries. In many ways, the Doha round agricultural negotiations was a negotiation around this kind of an exchange, and the negotiation broke down on both sides. The rich countries were not so sure they wanted to expose their farmers to competition from labor-intensive, low-wage agricultural producers. But interestingly, at the end of the day, India and China said they didn't want to expose their farmers to competition from the land-rich, resource-unstressed agricultures of the West. So we have some ways to go in order to bring sanity to that part of the negotiation. And I've already said enough probably about the availability of new technologies to reduce stress on land and water. But I think one of the things that we need in order to change this equation is to start pricing resource waste and water use much more transparently than we have in the past. And, these tend to result in bad externalities because people use too much water, they use it in a haphazard way. They don't worry about the runoff because historically we've had cheap energy and cheap chemicals and all of that, but those things are beginning to change. The last phase of food security is what I've called healthfulness. It's a fairly latter-day concern, but it's getting a lot of editorial attention. This is the link between our diets, our lifestyles, and a variety of long-term illnesses, type 2 diabetes, some types of cancer, heart disease, or just the general condition of obesity. There are, I think, out there two competing visions of the causation of this problem and what to do about it. One of those visions is that wants to divide the food supply into good foods and bad foods, and the solution is to eat more good foods and less bad foods. The other vision is one that's built around eating balanced diets, making good choices as to portion and how you cook foods, and taking responsibility for your diet and exercise regimes. Whichever side you come out on, both are going to involve substantial behavior change on the part of consumers. These are not problems that are going to be solved at the food supply end of the equation without a lot of change on the food demand side. In the class, we talk a little bit about some of the more popular recommendations for dealing with this. Organic foods is one of the favorites of the good versus bad foods community. Organic foods are good, conventional foods are bad. The problem is there's little scientific evidence to support the claim that organic foods are either more nutritious or less involving less pesticide risk, because pesticide-related risks are dosage-related rather than zero Delaney Clause type zero risk related. But the bigger problem is that, however appealing it may be to some as a way of spending their discretionary income, it's not a long-term solution for everyone, because the implications for resource use are staggering. And there's a guy named Bob Thompson who teaches at the University of Illinois, teaches a class very much like this, who's been doing some projecting of income gains for the population globally. He argues that organic food will not even be an effective solution for well-off consumers because the size of that portion of our population is growing very rapidly. And if all of the people who make $15,000 a year or more start shifting toward organic diets. The implications for the resource base are scary. So we have to find other ways to get at that problem. Another, if you saw in the New York Times, I think about 3-4 weeks ago, Michael Pollan, a Berkeley journalism professor, wrote a letter to the next president of the United States advocating a major change in U.S. food policy away from integrating in the global world to going to local food production. And I mean, he takes it very local. He wants to put literally tens of millions of people back on farms, wants to have mobile slaughterhouses that'll drive around from farm to farm to provide processing services. Anyhow, the local foods approach is also not likely to be a universal solution. It's very high cost. Again, it tends to maybe appeal to the values of some with high discretionary income, but it is not going to help us solve the food security problem for the world as a whole. One of the variations on this argument is that local food production takes the high cost of transporting food through international trade out of the equation. Food miles is the notion of the argument. In fact, people would like to see every food labeled by the amount of energy that was consumed in transporting it to the marketplace. The trouble is that the energy that goes into transportation is a very small share of the energy that's used to produce and deliver that food, and that the energy used to transport it from producer to consumer store is less than the energy that's used to produce it, to move it from the store to the consumer's home. So if you really want to attack the food miles problem, it's the last mile that is the expensive transportation.
So people should have to eat in centralized sites.
That's right. Or bike to the store. Biking to the store is okay, but bringing the bags home is the problem. In terms of solutions, as I mentioned, I think technology is beginning to address this issue of reducing the exposure to and the toxicity of the pesticides that are in necessarily in the food production system. Maybe more further out, but encouraging, is the idea of using that technology to fit diets to individualized health profiles. That's probably something that we will see over the next decade. And of course, again, trade makes all of this variety available at lower cost than trying to produce it locally. So, to conclude this first part, if you look at food security as kind of the way I have done it, and break it into constituent parts, one of the important lessons from that is that there is no simple solution. This is not a simple problem. There are a lot of varieties of insecurity in the food supply, and there isn't one single policy tool that addresses all of them, so that you have to start looking at a tool kit if you're really going to address all of these issues. It's also, I think, to remind us that while we think that poor countries are food insecure and we are not, that is not necessarily the case. Wealthy countries tend to have concerns more in the sustainability and healthfulness end of the diet, but in fact we have our share of chronically hungry and intermittently hungry people in our own populations, and we have food safety issues as we see periodically breaking out. So even wealthy countries have a fair part of this spectrum. Poor countries, interestingly, experience all of them, including obesity. Some of the fastest rates of growth of obesity in the world are occurring in poor developing countries among some segments of the population. In the class, what I try to get the class to appreciate is that a combination of freer trade, focused kinds of assistance, and technology-friendly cultures will address food security issues at lower cost than will protectionism, broad-based kinds of domestic policies like price controls and a technology-resistant culture. In other words, preserve the sort of traditional diet and lifestyle. Both will get you where you want to go, but one has much higher cost profile than the other. We're going to leave food security and move on to biofuels, but I want to do it with a transition. I realized after I told Bob I would talk about food security and biofuels that I at least feel like you need a context for looking at both of these issues, sort of how I see the world food economy functioning. And so I'd like to take just a few minutes to talk about two aspects of the world food economy. The first is agriculture's role in development. I'm going to do this very quickly. And then agriculture's role in the food economy. I may even use these. Poor countries have about 60 to 70% of their populations dependent on agriculture. Typically, those people are embedded in static, inefficient, peasant types of agricultural systems. Subsistence in the box down there. Rich countries have less than 5% of their populations typically dependent on agriculture. Those people engaged in farming are typically engaged in dynamic, commercial, highly efficient farming systems. So we have a development paradox. I'll try to illustrate that with this little graphic here. Share the population on the vertical axis, productivity on the horizontal axis. What it says is that to begin the economic development process, which is really to move from here to here, requires increases in agricultural productivity. It will not start unless you can stimulate agricultural productivity growth. It will not continue, however, unless you can find ways to gainfully employ people who are being released from agriculture as a result of that productivity revolution. And it's very important to the development process that those people leave agriculture not because they are forced out of it, or that the policy mix is forcing them out of it, but rather because the policy mix is drawing them into other economic activities, either to serve a more commercialized agricultural sector or eventually to serve a broader demand base. There are three tools, essentially, that you use in moving down that development path. Three, if you're into alliteration, you can do them as S's: specialization, science, and scale economies. And unless you can find ways of harnessing those three activities to transferring people in a thoughtful and considerate way from agriculture into a non-agricultural part of the economy, you're not going to have sustainable economic development. The goal is to leave both those who remain in agriculture and those who leave it better off at the end of the day. The important point that's sort of contentious or a part of the political debate is that you cannot achieve the start of that unless you support the development of commercial farming systems. Specialization doesn't occur under subsistence agriculture. It only occurs as you begin to commercialize. You won't reward science and attract new technologies unless you begin to commercialize the agricultural system. And you won't clearly achieve the scale economies that drive productivity growth unless you begin to do that. The challenge is to do that in a way that finds alternatives for the people who are released from agriculture. The second point I want to make is agriculture's role in the food economy. And there's a simple point at the start. Over the last century, real food prices, that is adjusted for inflation, declined dramatically throughout the entire century. And they did so for essentially two reasons. One is that we moved acres out of fuel production for draft and transportation animals and into food production, and because we achieved dramatic factor productivity gains in agriculture. The major benefit that came out of that is that falling real grain prices did more than anything else to reduce global hunger. Even China's economic development in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, which lifted several hundred million people out of hunger, did not have as much hunger-reducing effect as this long-term trend in falling real grain prices. Why is that important? Because this century, real grain prices have been increasing. And they have been increasing because acreage is moving back into fuel production and because productivity trends are declining. Starting in the mid-1980s, we started reducing public funding on agricultural research and development, and also to divert some of that research funding into non-productivity uses. And we are now beginning to see trend yields slow down as a result of that. So if you look at agriculture's role or challenge, if you wish, going forward, we're going to increase world population about 50%. A substantial share of the existing and new people are going to be earning more money per day. A lot of them are going to move into out of the less than $2 a day category, which is sort of definition of poverty, into the $2 to $10 per day levels of per capita income, where a high percentage of that increased income is spent on diversifying their diet. And so you combine a 50% increase in population and that demographic change in per capita incomes, by 2050 we're going to have to double world grain production. So challenge number one is to double world grain production in the next 50 years. If you add sustainability and climate change criteria to that, we need to do that while using less land, water, and other resources that have a high carbon profile. And so you have to ask the question, can we do those two things and still leave room for biofuels? And if we can, of what sort of biofuel production? So that's my transition to biofuels. And
Before you complete the transition, can I ask a question?
Yes.
I noticed that you had only touched very glancingly on the issue where you mentioned biotech, GMOs, and the opposition to GMOs on the basis of the precautionary principle. And if this is going to sidetrack you, please ignore my question. But could you give us a thumbnail sort of overview of your take on whether or not GMOs do represent some sort of panacea, and what the political state of play is?
We spent a whole class session on biotech, but to give you a quick take on both parts of your question. Biotechnology is not a panacea in the sense that it's the only tool, but it is a very important tool. It's an important tool not only because it allows us to, some of the low-hanging fruit and productivity gains comes from reducing losses to pests, and it's a very powerful technology for doing that. You will see, if you watch U.S. corn yields, you will see that we have been increasing the national average corn yield at a higher rate than than I've said is implicit in the gene stock. That's because we've reduced pre-harvest losses very significantly. And if you move that technology into developing countries, payback is very large. It's also, I think, very important for addressing this sustainability question. Politics are more problematic. As you obviously know, the opponents of biotechnology in Europe effectively used the precautionary principle, which was not designed for that application, but for a different application, to argue that GMOs, genetically engineered foods, were hazardous to people and the environment. There is a subtle shift, I think, occurring in the leadership within the European community. And it's not being driven by any shift in those consumer preferences. It's being driven instead by the realization that their decision to preclude the use of GMOs is denying the technology to Africa and Asia. And the same sort of NGO communities that got behind the anti-GMO movement are now, I think, being attacked for the food crisis implications of that strategy and are developing some sensitivity to that criticism. So what happens? I think you are going to see the European system evolve so that it becomes more tolerant of what I would call dual channels, that for those people in Europe who want to avoid biotech, there will be marketing channels that deliver them food, and they will have to pay a higher price for that. And then there will be a marketing channel available to those who are willing to take on those risks. And that will begin to open a market for not so much U.S. products as it will be value-added products from developing countries, where the genetically engineered grains are an input into the production of those. But it has, there have been, the other thing that's happening is that there's more awareness that unlike mechanization and a lot of chemical parts of agriculture, biotech is by and large scale neutral. And so it is accessible to small farmers as well as to larger farmers. And that as a development tool, it's more important to have access to that technology as opposed to, large tractors are not a particularly powerful development tool for small-scale agriculture, but biotech seeds would be. And so that's also, I think, beginning to factor into the equation. But it's not going to change quickly. But I've been following this debate for 12 years now, and this is sort of the first signs that the Europeans may be shifting gears a little bit.
I have a question regarding the first section, food security. You mentioned that it's not a problem of supply, and so that means that there is no issue in terms of distribution of food. Is it your position between developing and developed countries?
Well, there are people who will formulate the chronic hunger problem by saying it's not a question of supply, it's a question of distribution. That, I think, is too glib an answer, because why is it a problem of distribution? It's a problem of distribution because poor people can't afford it. Governments have not built the infrastructure to deliver it to rural areas. Oftentimes pursue policies that discourage commerce, particularly regional trade, so that you would. So there's a lot embedded in the idea of saying it's a problem of distribution that needs to be teased out.
The poor people cannot afford because developed countries buy at higher price. So of course, for farmers, it's more attractive to sell to developed countries than local people. If we look at the waste out of kitchen or restaurant in developed country, of course, we waste out of food. And one of the solutions I would put in your list would be the change of habit. Why do we have to waste food while the other side of the earth and there are people suffering?
Well, a couple of answers. First, there are food rescue programs here in the United States in order to harvest that food for addressing the needs of our own hungry. It's probably not a very effective strategy for addressing the needs of the hungry elsewhere in the world. In terms of pricing, yes, agricultural prices are probably the sector of the economy where there is the most destructive distortion in pricing. Developed countries tend to pursue policies that subsidize production. Developing countries tend to pursue policies that tax production. My argument would be both are wrong. Both need to start moving toward letting prices reflect the underlying economics of producing and distributing those goods. And then you address those segments of the population that can't afford a complete diet at those price levels with targeted assistance, and get out of the business of trying to manage the whole price level to deal with that problem. I think it's a better strategy.
You mentioned that there is, I don't know how you call it, the food supply system, NGOs. Is it NGO that you are talking about from the U.S.? To give food away to people in developing countries. There's such system. Yes, indeed, there are many systems, but is it really sustainable? Can they really make their own life out of this support?
Most of the food distribution systems, subsidized food distribution systems, are not NGOs, they're governments. Okay. And all I'm saying is that if a government is willing to spend a certain resource level on dealing with the hunger problem, it is more efficient to target people who are truly in need rather than to try to manage prices down in order to take care of them, and in the process reward middle and upper income groups with underpriced food and to tax their own agricultures, and so they become increasingly dependent on outside resources rather than their own food production. So but we could go on for a long time, I think, on that issue.
We'll never let you get to biofuels.
Yeah, that's the problem. Right?
Yeah, so why don't you take 5 minutes to get to biofuels, and we'll ask.
Okay. Since I'm going to be very critical of biofuels policies, I'll start this by saying that the problem is not biofuels, but the policies that we've decided on to encourage the emergence of this industry. I'm going to focus on corn-based ethanol because that's hands down the largest in the United States. There are over 200 initiatives at the local, federal, and state level, local, state, and federal level to promote biofuels, but there are 3 that are particularly important. The first is ethanol import tariffs. We have a 2.5% ad valorem duty, which is only marginally distorting. We have a 54-cent a gallon duty, specific duty on ethanol imports. Specific duty is, I would tell you, is particularly insidious because as you reduce your price in order to try to be competitive as an importer, the effective rate of protection goes up because the duty is insensitive to that price. The effect of the duty, however, has been to reduce the supply of ethanol available in the United States, raise domestic corn prices in order to respond to that contrived shortage, and then divert more corn from food to fuel uses. The second policy tool is what's called the blender's tax credit. People who blend ethanol and gasoline get a tax credit for the ethanol that they blend in. It has been 51 cents a gallon. It's going down to 45 cents a gallon. People say that doesn't sound like much. If you take national average corn yield land, it amounts to $200 an acre to divert the corn from food to fuel uses. It is a very, very significant distortion of the marketplace. The third and most insidious of the policies is what I call usage mandates. Energy Security Act of 2007 that has been bragged on by candidates for the Senate in the state, raised the mandated incorporation of ethanol into the transport fuel supply by 2012 from 7.5 billion gallons to 15 billion gallons. That's from roughly 5% of our fuel use to roughly 10%. The effect of that decision was, up until then, the ramp-up rate for moving corn-based ethanol production was around 200 million bushels a year, incremental gain in consumption. That's 1.5 times the trend rate of growth in corn yields. Manageable, the diversion or displacement of other sources of demand was relatively small. When you go from 7.5 to 15 billion gallons by 2012, the ramp-up rate went to 800 million gallons a year, which is 6 to 7 times the trend yield growth. It meant either we were going to displace other crops by buying land into corn production, or we were going to displace other uses of corn because it wasn't going to be available at a price that was agreeable. What I did in the notes here was try and give you some sense of how large a diversion that turned out to be. We went from 1 billion bushels of corn being used for ethanol production